So we did our presentation on the Korean War. I'm Marley. My group members are Lorenzo and Joshua. Alright, so the beginning of the Korean War, it started on 6/25/1950. Started by the North. There was a long time where historians debated whether or not the North Korea started it or South Korea started the war, but it was found out that North Korea actually wrote a letter to Russia asking for permission to start the war. So that confirmed that the North was the ones that started the aggressions. And shortly after starting the war, they caught the South completely off guard and were easily able to march down through Seoul and captured it within 3 days of the conflict starting. The U.S. and the UN immediately tried to call for peace and asked the North to cease aggressions towards the South, but they were completely ignored, and as the North really didn't fear any diplomatic repercussions. They actually continued marching south so far southward, pushing South Korea down all the way to southwest in Incheon. And on September 15th, Douglas MacArthur, who had just recently been appointed as the general by the UN and the U.S. to deal with the conflict in the Korean Peninsula, Douglas MacArthur landed at Incheon on September 15th. After landing at Incheon and winning the Battle of Incheon, he began his march northward from Incheon, carving a swath through the now northern occupied territory all the way back up to Seoul, and they ended up capturing it again in the battle known as the Second Battle of Seoul. So U.S. forces, had to carve all the way up through northern occupied territory, and even once reaching Seoul, they didn't even stop there. They continued going northwards across the 30th parallel into northern territory. They went so far northwards that they actually ended up coming up to the border of China. And it's at this point that it's been a couple of months into the war. It's now October. It's at this point that China decides to intervene in the war. So the major battles at the beginning of the war, there was the Battle of Osan on July 5th, 1950, where it was one of the earliest engagements. It's probably the earliest documented engagement between U.S. forces and North Korean forces. I mean, it took place just south of Seoul when the South Koreans were retreating. The North Koreans ended up catching up to them and flanking the U.S. forces. These U.S. forces were stationed in Seoul before the war even started. And due to poor equipment and a lack of organized leadership, this is all because, they were caught off guard. The North attacked the South with no warning. They led to a defeat, and this defeat and this atmosphere of chaos and a lack of leadership is what would persist through the early few months of the war from the South and the U.S. forces until the Battle of Incheon. So the Battle of Incheon was on September 10th to the 19th of 1950. The Incheon battle was the start of the U.S. push northwards that would eventually cut a swath into the North itself. So it was the most notable battle in the early stages of the war because it indicated a clear turning on the tides of the war. So the South had been pushed all the way back down to just a small area in the southwest of the peninsula, and because of the Battle of Incheon, it gave them momentum enough to push the North all the way back into their own territory and even further into their own territory. So the Second Battle of Seoul was when they recaptured Seoul from the North after it was captured for 3 days before the war started. So it also marks the start of the push even further northwards. Not the counterattack anymore. Now it's an offensive of its own. So up to this point, up to the Battle of Seoul, it had been recapturing land that was lost to the North, and now they're actually beginning to move into the North itself. So now I'm going to be discussing the middle of the war, which took place from 1950, November 1950 to July 1953. So now I'm going to be discussing the middle of the war. So the middle of the war, at this point, the U.S. has pushed the northern forces all the way back up to the Chinese and North Korean border. And that really, the Chinese saw at that point that they had to be involved, or else the U.S. was gonna exterminate their communist allies. So they begin to move troops towards the Sino-Chinese border, which is the Korean-Chinese border, and they did a surprise attack on the U.S. forces and established a route after winning the battle. They established a trade route, or not a trade route, sorry. They established a supply route and a foothold for them to move troops forward into Korea. So the surprise attack happened, and then they begin trying to push the UN out of the north, which was phase 2 of their 5-stage campaign. They begin to try and push the UN forces out of the north, and even once they reach stage 3, they try and push them back, not just out of the north, but across the borders, so into the southern territory, and they try to recapture Seoul for the second time. They try to capture it because they already had it at the beginning of the war. They try to recapture it for the second time, and they do succeed in recapturing Seoul. And this is when they begin to use guerrilla warfare. So then in phase 4, after capturing Seoul for the second time, they had to recuperate and actually pull back a little bit because they had expended so many resources, so many supplies, and they were spread very thin, trying to hold the land that they just got. So phase 5 is the final phase, and it's ultimately where they failed. Is after they're overextended for a while and they have Seoul, the U.S. actually recaptures Seoul again. So now Seoul has changed hands 3 times. If at the beginning of the war it was captured by the North, and then the South captured it again, and then the North, and now the South again, and the U.S. again. So they recapture Seoul, and they actually the PVA, which is the People's Volunteer Army, it's the Chinese army, actually has to retreat. So the first few phases of their offensive turned the tide in favor of China and the North for a short while, for about a few months, until phase 5 when they failed. July 1951 is after phase 5. It marks the start of the stalemate period of the war, where not much land is lost. The front lines stayed close to the previous divide, which is the 38th parallel, and the fighting continued, but there was very little territory loss or gain. So they might gain a couple of miles of land in one battle, but then the next day they'll lose a couple miles. So it stayed pretty stagnant near the divide. So I'm going to be discussing now the major battles in the middle of the war. So the Battle of Ulsan, not to be confused with the Battle of Osan. The Battle of Ulsan took place November 4th, 1950. It was the first confrontation between U.S. and China, not the first between U.S. and North Korea. The U.S. and China. And it took place. This is the battle where the Chinese surprise attacked the southern forces and the U.S. forces near the Sino-Chinese border. And this marks the tide shifting yet again in favor of the North, as they begin to push the UN forces out of the northern part of the peninsula and even further into their own territory. So this is also the first phase of the Chinese offensive. Then there's the third Battle of Seoul, where the PVA marched past the 38th parallel. PVA is the Chinese army, marched past the 38th parallel and engaged UN forces at the Imjin River, which is near Seoul. Ultimately, they ended up puncturing a hole in the UN's defenses and forcing the evacuation of Seoul for the second time, and they captured Seoul again. And this caused a huge drop in morale in the UN forces, because they thought that they were doing well. They had gained all this momentum in the war, recapturing Seoul and even pushing the North back, but now they realized that they were actually in trouble again. So the fourth Battle of Seoul, the U.S. and the southern forces kind of got their bearings back and recaptured Seoul again from the overextended PVA. The PVA had expended lots of resources trying to hold Seoul, so they were very tired out. The soldiers didn't have as much ammunition and weaponry and stuff, so it was a fairly easy battle for the fourth time. And battle at the Imjin River, it marks the failure of the fifth and final phase of the Chinese offensive. It's the last major battle of the war before the stalemate. So now I want to talk about the end of the war, which is from 1953 all the way up to 1954 when the war officially ended. So pretty much how the rest of the war goes on is the small battles and eventually a lack of battles altogether. And the trouble with them, they wanted to declare peace, both sides did, but they couldn't agree on how to exchange prisoners in the peace talks. So the repatriation is when a prisoner of war is sent back to the country that he comes from. So the UN wanted voluntary repatriation, which means that you can choose to, because a lot of the Northerners, I'm sure, would a lot of North Koreans and Chinese would stay with the U.S. and the South, but the PVA wanted forced repatriation because they wanted all of theirs back, even if the people didn't want to come back. So eventually, after a lot of debate, they decided to let people voluntarily repatriate to a certain degree. Certain places were allowed to, and certain other camps weren't. So the armistice of 1953 put an end officially to the hostilities of the war, which means no more fighting, no more battles. And the last exchange involving the war was on November 1954, when they exchanged dead that had been killed in battle. So the aftermath of the war is the DMZ, which is the demilitarized zone, established, which is that line you see where you see the North Korean troops and the South Korean troops standing on either side of the line, just facing each other and making sure nothing happens. It halted the threat of communism in Asia to a certain degree until Vietnam. Created two independent nations, North Korea and South Korea. And ultimately the North gained a city, but they lost about 1,500 square miles of land, which is not a fair trade for them. And the North decided to try and re-spark the Korean War in 1975 when communists sprung up in North Vietnam, but China refused to assist, so the North was forced to not do it. And despite the armistice, North Korea continues its aggression, even formally declaring that it was no longer bound by the ceasefire. In 2013, they said that the armistice no longer mattered to them. And it stated that it was not above using nuclear weaponry on U.S., Japan, and South Korea, and we have seen lots of missile threats and missile tests in the past years or so, the past couple of years. So while the war may be over for now, it may not be over in the long run. Thank you.